Big Bend National Park. The sign announced my arrival in a familiar font of all official Park Service communication. The ranger's booth beyond it grew large as I approached. I slowed down to halt alongside the squat yellow hut and paused my podcast. Afternoon, friend. The attending ranger greeted me with a bored smile that reached barely to the corners of her mouth. I nodded my head in response. The entrance fee increased to $30 this year, she intoned. We can take cash or charge. I fished my wallet from the backpack on the seat next to me and handed her two 20s. She returned a 10 but kept a hold of the bill as she handed it through the window. Be safe out there. We locked eyes, and she fixed me with a meaningful glare that seemed to say she was more concerned with my behavior than my safety. And don't talk to the animals. She relinquished the change. I shook my head, marveling at the strange warning, and drove on, hitting play on my phone. Indeed, listener, it's best if you don't acknowledge these creatures at all. The podcaster pronounced this final sentence of the program in a tone that he no doubt imagined to convey solemn gravitas. Cheesy music and a cheap howling wind sound effect signaled the end of the episode. I fiddled with my phone, tapping into a playlist I'd labeled Old News. The Eagles crooned back at me. The sound cut out. I wrestled with the auxiliary cord that connected my phone to my car speakers, and glanced at the home screen. No service. I stared at the now useless brick for a moment before turning my attention back to the road in front of me. Without my primary source of entertainment, I scanned through the radio stations, hoping to find something other than the breathless preaching that dominated the airwaves outside of the state's major population centers. I found only static. Admitting defeat, I turned my focus from the dashboard to get a proper look at my surroundings. Tall yellow grass grew mysteriously from rocky soil that did not appear capable of supporting life. Crooked trees, all limbs bent at impossible angles from the terrain. The scrubland, dotted with cacti, gave way to jagged mountains that stretched far into the horizon, and foliage seemed to grow thicker with elevation. Across the alien landscape, tiny roadrunners bolted back and forth, chasing some elusive prey on their impossibly fast little legs. Or I chuckled to myself. Perhaps they were eluding a dim-witted coyote. My car jolted as if I'd hit a pothole. The explosion of feathers across my windshield, however, indicated that the bump had not been the result of a shortfall in the park's maintenance budget. I cursed aloud. The view had distracted me. I resolved to focus on the road rather than the environment, figuring there'd be time enough to appreciate the majesty of nature during my hike. A nearby sign indicated the Lost Mines Trail, my destination, to be several miles further. After another eerily silent half an hour on the road, I reached the trailhead. A smiling older couple, each wielding two walking sticks, lumbered off the path as I pulled into a nearby parking space. I collected my phone from the dashboard and my backpack from the seat next to me, along with my boots from the floor. Stepping out of the car, I stretched my legs and popped the trunk. The older gentleman, presumably husband to his hiking partner, walked around behind my car and greeted me with a friendly wave as I sat to change my shoes. Looks like you'll have the trail to yourself this afternoon, pal. He flourished his hand magnanimously at the empty parking spaces around us. Oh, you didn't see anyone else out here. I pulled on my dusty brown boots as he shook his head. Nope, just that old boot over there. He gestured towards his wife. I laughed as if his joke had been funny and double knotted my laces. You have the most beautiful eyes, croaked the old woman, cued by his gesture. You just don't see that color blue every day. I chuckled and thanked her. You folks have a good evening now, I said, shouldering on my backpack. I pulled my hat low over my eyes to keep what I now realized to be a blazing afternoon sun off of my face. The blue of the hat's brim now occupied nearly half of my visual field, and it obscured the old folks as I waved. You too, young fella. I looked up to see the old man return the wave and stump back to his wife beside their Prius. Watching the hunched gentleman labored across the mere feet of the parking lot, I marveled that he'd been able to complete the trail's steep climb. Maybe the couple had kept their walk short. In any event, I set out toward the path. The first mile or so of Lost Mines proceeds mostly uphill. Bristly flora frame the entire trail, and the low bushes make it easy to forget that the path winds through the middle of the desert and not somewhere more hospitable. As the trail's switchbacks carve their way up the mountain every few 100 yards, a clearing in the foliage reveals a sweeping view of the surrounding landscape. I covered this first stretch in a little less than half an hour. Hoping to capture the scenery for a new computer background, I paused in one of these gaps in the foliage and pulled out my phone. The vista proved hard to photograph, though, and my efforts resulted in only a single passable shot. I dropped my phone back into my pocket and unscrewed my water bottle from the strap of my backpack. I took in the scenery as I drank. The snuffling sound interrupted my commune with nature. My stomach dropped, and I spun my head in search of the noise. I'm a big guy, but I'm hardly a match for the black bears that frequent this part of the park. I spotted it to the left, a coyote. I froze and watched the creature emerge from the bushes. It had its back to me, and its head in one of the prickly bushes off the trail. It continued snuffling around in the foliage, but its rummaging was bringing it closer to me. I slowly screwed the top back onto my water bottle. Coyotes don't usually attack people, but in emergency, I could use the mostly full bottle to bludgeon the beast. The coyote raised its hand and froze. It sniffed the air slowly. It turned to face me. I locked eyes with it. The creature looked wrong. It almost seemed to have two snouts, one on top of the other. The deformity looked like a video game rendering error of the sort that makes a virtual plant disappear into a wall and come out the other side. Like one snout had incorrectly rendered inside the other, and a tiny bit of the duplicate, just the nose, was poking through the coyote's face. I stared into the creature's wide, dark eyes for what felt like hours. Its noses twitched, both of them, as it sniffed the air. "Easy, boy." I muttered the words to the creature in what I hoped to be a slow, calming whisper. "Take it easy." The beast stared. I didn't move a muscle. Then the coyote cocked its odd head to the side and quickly, so quickly that I still questioned whether it had happened at all. The coyote winked behind me. A branch snapped and I spun. Finding nothing, I turned quickly back to the creature, but was gone, scared away, no doubt by the noise. I was breathing heavily, far more heavily than my brief hike up the trail merited. It took a moment to collect myself. I'd seen deformed animals before, goats with extra legs, deer with stubby little antlers. This coyote was just an accident of birth, the product of a twisted genome. Surely it hadn't actually winked at me, and even if it had, it was an animal. So it couldn't have been communicating anything with a minor twitch. I carried on up the trail, but the image of the coyote and its bizarre double snout stayed with me. Around mile 1.5, I reached another clearing on the left-hand side of the path. This rest stop featured a bench carved from one of the sharp little trees. I paused briefly to tighten the laces on my boots and take a sip from my Nalgene. As I screwed the cap back on, movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention. I spun, half expecting to find the coyote staring back at me. Instead, I found another hiker passing me on the trail. He was descending, heading the opposite direction from me. The man wore brown hiking boots that rose to mid-calf. Gray socks extended from underneath, just a bit further up his calves, ending below olive green work shoes the same color as my own. Unlike mine, however, his shorts lacked a little loop from which someone using them for manual labor might hang a hammer. They also lacked the little yellow C that marked the brand on the back right pocket. His blue baseball cap was pulled low enough that I didn't get a good look at his face, but I noticed that his gray t-shirt seemed entirely free of sweat. The man raised a hand as I turned, though didn't say anything. "How's that last stretch?" I asked as he passed to my right. "Easy." He rumbled the word in a deep baritone, not much louder than a whisper. Drawing it out into a languid assurance, he continued down the trail. "How's the view?" I asked for his back. "Easy." I heard again, in the same slow whisper, before the hiker disappeared around the next switchback. I shook my head, not sure I'd heard the guy correctly, as I gathered my belongings and finished lacing my boots. The sun was beginning to sink. I reached the trail's peak a little less than a mile later, and was greeted by a sweeping view of the surrounding desert. By then, a brilliant sunset painted the desert, and I marveled at the view for nearly 20 minutes. As I made my way back down the trail, the temperature dropped with the sun. A cloudy evening obscured the views I'd enjoyed on the way up, and by the time I'd reached halfway down the trail, I had to use the flashlight on my phone to light the path in front of me. Hiking at night is always unnerving. This wasn't the first time I'd been caught out on a trail after sundown, and the desert path was much less intimidating than some of the more heavily wooded trails in the other parks I visited. Still, the normal sounds of wildlife become much more sinister at night. As I descended, my thoughts turned back to the events of the day. I'd woken up at the crack of dawn to make the long drive. I didn't mind road trips, but the space between Austin and Big Bend was just empty. Not like one little town every couple of miles empty, completely empty. Bring a spare can of gas and make sure you fill up every time you see a station empty. I'd really plumbed the depths of the podcast universe, and even my favorite programs had run stale by the time I'd reached the welcome sign. What was it the ranger had said to me? Don't talk to the animals. I suppose a person has to be a bit odd to become a park ranger anyway, especially one way out here in the middle of nowhere. Still, strange thing to say. The memory of the odd warning brought to mind the coyote with its warp system error snout. I shuddered at the image. A branch snapped to my left. Wind whistled through the bushes. I speed up. A rock had found its way into one of my boots, and I bent to fish it out. The wind was whistling again. I held my phone in my mouth as I pulled one of my socks higher to make the boot a bit more accessible. The laces had loosened over the course of the day, and I could fit a finger down to the sole. I found the pebble and worked it out of my shoe with my index finger. I rolled it just past the top lace near the middle of my calf. It was difficult to see the little gray stone. It matched the color of my socks nearly exactly, and the low light didn't help. I managed to grab it before it could fall back into my boots, though, and tossed it into the brush along the side of the path. It made a small click as it landed. I stood and continued. I didn't get more than a few steps before I felt a tiny impact on the side of my leg. Assuming I'd kicked up a stick as I'd been walking, I carried on. After another few steps, though, I felt another pebble in my boot. This one hadn't gotten deep, and I didn't need my light to fish it out. I held it between my index finger and thumb. This one, too, matched my socks. I tossed it as I had the other and carried on. A few steps later, I felt another impact, this time in my ear. A bug, surely. I paused briefly before speeding up. Crickets buzzed loudly, and the nighttime whine seemed to come from every direction at once. A branch snapped. I was nearly jogging by the time I heard it. Easy, slow, deep, quiet. So quiet I couldn't be sure I'd heard it at all. I broke into a run all around me. The trail seemed to come alive. Branches snapped, and the wind rustled, and crickets whined so loudly it was nearly deafening. My phone's light bounced as I ran, and my backpack jostled uncomfortably on my back. A root caught my foot. I threw my hands out to break my fall. The trail's tiny sharp rocks dug painfully into my knees and my palms as I hit the ground. I scrambled to stand, but as I looked up I found myself eye level with a pair of brown hiking boots. Easy. On my hands and knees in the dust of the trail, bleeding into the grit, I froze. Strong hands hoisted me from the ground, and I could do nothing but allow myself to be lifted. After an eternity, I raised my eyes and found myself face to face with a park ranger. Easy, she said in the same careful tone that she'd used when selling my admission ticket, not the hiker's creepy whisper. I caught my breath for a moment before I responded, thanks. I dusted off my shorts and stepped back. Once I collected myself, I realized that I'd reached the end of the path and the ranger stood at the trailhead. My car was just a few feet away, and a light over the parking lot illuminated us. The ranger was holding a shotgun. She wasn't pointing it at me precisely, but she certainly wasn't pointing it anywhere else either. If she fired it, she'd probably blow off a few of my toes. Behind her stood the old couple I'd seen on the way up the path. The old man stood straighter now than he had earlier in the afternoon, and he traded his walking sticks for a shotgun of his own. His wife, too, was armed, and the three of them stood unmoving. Between me and my aging forerunner, none of them looked directly at me. In fact, each seemed to be looking pointedly at a spot where I wasn't. What did I tell you when you first came into the park this afternoon, friend? The ranger asked the question carefully and without much inflection. She still didn't meet my eyes, instead staring at the path behind me. Given her monotone, I couldn't tell whether she was scolding me or testing me. "Don't talk to me." I paused the coyote. "Don't talk to the animals." I finished the ranger and her companions, all visibly deflated as if they'd been holding their breath. Each of the three of them finally turned their eyes to me, and the ranger shouldered her firearm. "Friend, you get back in that car and you head straight out of this park." The old man commanded me with a gravity that could not possibly have come from the doddering old fellow I'd met earlier in the day. "Don't stop, not for nothing," the old woman added. "Or nobody." She fixed me with a steely gaze that matched the gravity of her husband's. "Not until you're out of the park." "I wouldn't worry too much about the speed limit either, friend," the ranger added. I opened my mouth to ask what in God's name the three of them were talking about, but the ranger fixed her jaw in such a way as to indicate that the conversation was over. The old couple wore similar expressions, and the three of them turned their full attention to the path, guns aimed to the ground. I followed their instructions. I didn't change my boots. I didn't take off my shirt, even though a day's worth of sweat had turned into gray material, nearly the same color black as my car's upholstery. The 4Runner came to life with its deep rumble, and I stomped the gas, peeling out of the parking lot with a squeal. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was nearly 3 miles from the trailhead. The road in and out of Big Bend is straight and covers several miles between the park entrance and the trails. I'd finally begun to relax, and I could see the ranger's booth in the distance when I heard it again. Easy. The same slow whisper. So quiet that my rumbling engine nearly drowned it out. I spun my head in every direction. The sun was all the way down by this point, and I couldn't see much outside the too dim glow of my headlights. I heard it again. "Easy, boy." The same tone. The same whisper. "Take it easy, boy." Faster this time, but not like a person who talked fast, like a video game played at double speed. I continued to look frantically around me, doing my best to keep some attention on the road. Motion at the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned my head to the right at the very edge of the half circle of RD. Illuminated in my headlights ran an animal. An animal that looked like it had two snouts, one on top of the other. I stomped the gas. Easy. Loud, deafening, but still soft somehow. Like the recording of a whisper played at full volume through an expensive sound system. The ranger's hut grew larger in the distance. I kept my attention on the road in front of Maine, but from the corner of my eye I could see that the coyote, the whatever it was still right on the edge of my headlights, a chance to look at it. Only for a moment. The sight still haunts me. On the edge of the road, just outside the light of my headlights, ran the coyote on its hind legs. Its twin snouts foamed, and its mouth yawned open as it panned. The creature's jaw opened wider than any natural being's ought to, and row upon row of human-looking teeth hung nearly to its chest, a chest that seemed to be wearing a gray t-shirt, but not wearing it precisely. Rather, the shirt seemed almost to grow from the creature's body, giving way seamlessly to the patchy fur of its arms and stomach. It turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes were no longer the white-brown eyes of an animal, but rather piercing blue eyes. Like a human's. Like mine. The coyote winked. I tore my gaze from the abomination to spare a glance at my speedometer. I was going 87 miles per hour. I wanted the aging SUV to go faster. Faster than it had any right to go. Faster than whatever was keeping pace with me out my window. I stole another glance at the creature. As I turned my head, I saw the beast stop, not slow down, stop completely, as if it had run into a wall. I whizzed past the ranger's hut and then the welcome sign and didn't ease up on the gas until both were firmly in my rear view. But I heard it again. "Take it easy." I slammed on the brakes, and I could smell the rubber burning under my tires. Don't let the sound of your own wheels make you crazy. The Eagles crooned from my car speakers. I had service again. The song it carried on right where it had left off as my phone picked up a signal. I put the old SUV in park right there in the middle of the road. Tears ran freely down my cheeks, and my hand shook so violently I couldn't have driven the car if I tried. I don't know how long I sat there, parked in the middle of the West Texas highway. Minutes. Half an hour. Hours. Once I'd pulled myself together, I called a Marfa hotel where I'd intended to spend the night and canceled my reservation. I drove straight home through the night and into the morning. I stopped only for gas and hardly took a breath until I reached my Austin apartment. I double locked the door, pulled the blinds closed, and collapsed, exhausted, into my bed. I'm still not sure just what the hell I saw out there in the desert, but the next morning I had the thought for the first time, but certainly not for the last, that maybe the national parks aren't just there to preserve natural beauty. Shenandoah, and how long will you be staying at the Skyline Lodge? I winced at the hotel's unfortunate name. The members of a Depression-era Public Works Committee had no doubt deliberated for months on just what to call Shenandoah's in-park accommodation, but their efforts had not paid off. Just the night I handed the desk my credit card. Well, we're glad you can join us. She passed a map over the counter, along with 2 keys and my receipt. You're in room 188 in the Hazeltop building. Just follow this road to the right. I thanked the woman, crossed the small lobby, and pushed open the door into a crisp autumn afternoon. My decrepit 4Runner waited in the lot outside. I dropped the room keys and their associated paperwork into my backpack on the front passenger seat and started the old beast. The SUV rumbled reluctantly to life, and its engine spluttered at the indignity of being called again to service so shortly after I'd last shut it off. I patted the dashboard affectionately. You're doing great, girl. As if on cue, the engine quieted at my affection. Rather than head directly to my no-doubt dingy room, I took a left out of the visitor center parking lot. I noted on the map that a portion of the Appalachian Trail crossed through the park just down the road. The trail was on my bucket list. I certainly couldn't hike the whole thing today, but I always enjoyed walking a few miles when I visited the parks I passed through. After only a moment on the road, I came to the Stony Man Trail parking lot. The area provided little more than a dusty shoulder off the main road, so I found a hospitable section of dirt to park the 4Runner. I opted to leave my backpack and boots in their place on the passenger seat, but decided to take my hat. As I unsnapped it from its place on my backpack strap, I remembered the cooler just below the seat. A lifetime ago, a college girlfriend had painted its top to mimic a brown wicker weave. A picnic basket for your next hike, she teased. A gift from a beach trip we'd taken with friends. The cooler lasted far longer than the relationship, and I'd filled it with sandwiches before departing from my Washington apartment. I lifted its lid, digging past a cold pack, to fetch a foil-wrapped turkey and Swiss. I stuffed my lunch into my back pocket and left several sandwiches and a sports drink for my return. The Stony Man Trail climbs gently uphill through 1.5 miles of dense woods. About halfway through the hike, the white blazes of the Appalachian Trail give way to blue swatches that mark a path to the summit. Autumn had decorated the Shenandoah foliage in brilliant orange, red, and green, and I found myself so caught up in this natural fireworks display that I nearly missed a turn. I managed to tear my attention from the trees for long enough to find my way, though, and after about half an hour of hiking, I reached the summit. Below me, the Shenandoah Valley stretched in every direction. Farmland checkered the countryside, creating a haphazard patchwork of wheat-brown, rolling green hills and brilliant autumn color. Little white farmhouses dotted the landscape, and I imagined their occupants concluding a hard day's work in front of roaring fire. I sat there daydreaming for some time. The drive had worn me out, though, and I looked forward to dinner, a good night's sleep, and a morning of hiking the next day. The blue blazes guided me back to the white swatches, and at a leisurely stroll, I made my way back down, accompanied by the lyrical trill of birdsong. After about 45 minutes of walking, I spotted the silver glint of my ancient car through the trees. As I got closer, though, I spotted something else. Distance. And the dense forest obscured my view, but through the trees, a massive animal seemed to wrap itself around the right side of my car. I stopped dead in my tracks. I couldn't see it clearly. I stared at the shape for what felt like hours, but was only surely minutes. I crept closer, a yard or two nearer. I could make out a few details. Shaggy arms pawed at the door, and claws clacked against the window. Oh, there. The creature seemed to stand head and shoulders above the SUV, though. A truly massive bear. I didn't dare venture any closer. A heavy impact shook the nearby branches. I glimpsed a flash of silver through the trees, and I realized what was happening. The beast was rocking my car, left and right. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare so much as blink, lest the animal turn its attention from my car to me. The thumping continued, for I don't know how long, and terrified though I was, I worried at how much abuse the old car could take. At this thought, though, the sound stopped. I couldn't see the black form through the trees anymore, but I also couldn't be sure it was gone. I waited, crouched amongst the trees. After what felt like hours, I worked up the courage to leave the woods for the parking lot. My car was in rough shape. Long scratches marked the windows, and the already battered exterior now sported several new, deep dents. I unlocked the door and climbed into the driver's seat. Turning the key in the ignition, I prepared myself for the worst. The 4Runner roared to life. Its engine thundered more vigorously even than it had when I left the lodge, as if the car was celebrating its own survival. I drove carefully back to Skyland, half expecting the bear to leap from the woods along the way. I made it back to the Welcome Center without incident, though, and parked the 4Runner in the same place I'd left it when I checked in. I figured that I ought to report the incident to a ranger, and I went inside to find one. The desk attendant was nowhere to be found. I poked around the lobby, passing a smattering of old couples and young families, but no ranger. A sign indicated the Mountain Tap Room to be around the corner. I followed it, telling myself I'd report the bear tomorrow. The restaurant was small, just a few square tables scattered across the floor and a small bar, all decorated in dark rustic wood. A young family sat at one of the tables, and the only other patron was stationed at the far end of the room, chatting pleasantly with the bartender. I parked myself 2 stools down from him. The man wore a red, gray, and green checked flannel shirt and a pair of faded light blue jeans. He sported salt and pepper black hair, cut near to a buzz on the sides. His hands, resting on the bar, were tanned, and while I couldn't see his palms, I knew they'd be calloused. He turned part of the way to me as I sat. I could only see his face in profile, and the partial view did not betray an age. He could have been anywhere from 30 to 60. "Evening, bud." He raised his beer. I lifted a hand in return, but didn't say anything back. I scanned the short menu as the bartender made her way to me. "What's it gonna be?" She asked for my order politely, but didn't offer a smile. "Three Rivers, Belgian." I selected the draft randomly from the list of unfamiliar beers, and a burger as well, please. She poured the drink and handed it over the bar. I nodded my thanks. "You spend a lot of time in the parks?" asked the man in flannel. He spoke in a confident baritone that immediately disarmed my usual hesitance to strike up conversation with strangers. The image of a coyote with 2 snouts flashed, unbidden through my mind. In the years since I'd visited Big Bend, that night's events had faded into memory. The steady march of time, coupled with a busy life and a cross-country move, had reduced the horrifying experience to little more than a distantly remembered fever dream. I convinced myself that what I saw in the desert had been the product of an overactive imagination and too many late-night podcasts. I banished the image from my mind and answered the question. I grew up hiking them. He turned more fully to face me. My dad was a ranger before we came along, so he used to take us all around. "Can always spot a friend of the parks," he responded, pronouncing the phrase as if it were an official title or a military rank. Cheers. We tapped our mugs. "How are the trails?" he asked. My rocking car returned immediately to the front of my mind, and before I could think better of it, I told him about the experience. Saw a bear out by Stony Man. Damn thing almost ripped my car in half. By this point, he turned in his stool to face me with his whole body. He raised his eyebrows, but his ageless face remained otherwise impassive. "You didn't leave food in the car, did you?" he asked. I cursed myself internally, remembering the cooler. Damn, I spoke as much to myself as to him. I suppose I did leave a couple of sandwiches in the cooler, didn't I? I knew better. His expression didn't change. "Did you get a good look at him?" He fixed me with an intense but unreadable stare, and I noticed that his eyes were nearly the same shade of gray as the hair at his temples. I shifted in my seat only through the trees. Couldn't see him all that clearly. He was big, though, a good bit taller than my car on his hind legs. The man wrinkled his brow and looked away for a moment before turning his gray eyes back to me. Did you see his feet? Excuse me? Surely I'd misheard him. Did you see his teeth? I let out a breath. The question was still strange, but at least it made proper reference to animal anatomy. No, I couldn't bring myself to get close enough. I chuckled at my own cowardice, but the man didn't return the laugh. He looked at me a moment longer and opened his mouth to speak. Whatever he'd been about to say, though, he thought better of it. He turned his attention to the bartender. Close me out, Katie. She nodded and began printing his check from the register. She brought his bill in a plastic tray, and he signed a receipt. I'm going to head out for the evening, pal. You make sure to report that bear to a ranger tomorrow. He didn't look at me as he spoke, and he was gone before I could return the farewell. I watched him go. Katie brought my burger, and I turned my attention to the food, putting the brief conversation out of my mind. A wave of exhaustion hit me nearly as soon as I finished the burger. The drive from DC, the hike, and an adrenaline hangover from my bear sighting combined all at once, and it was all I could do not to pass out on the bar. I closed out my tab and shuffled out to my car where it waited in the parking lot. On the way out, I passed the man from the bar, speaking into his cell phone. Rather than interrupt what appeared to be an intense conversation, I passed him without acknowledgement. A brief drive brought me to the Hazel Top. After finding a place for the 4Runner outside, I gathered my backpack and hauled the cooler from its place on the passenger side floor. I found room 188 just up a set of outside stairs and juggled my belongings, trying to hold my backpack, cooler, and keys all while unlocking the door. I managed to shoulder my way into the room, and the awkward shuffle brought me in backwards. I dumped my belongings on the floor and collapsed, thinking only of sleep, to the room's single bed. I woke up with a start some hours later. I'd fallen asleep in my clothes. I climbed from the bed, peeled off my jeans, tugged my musty t-shirt over my head, and stumbled to the bathroom. I considered showering, but told myself I'd do so in the morning. I rubbed my eyes as I shuffled back towards my bed. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw it. On the far wall, between the drawn blinds of two long windows, was painted a horrifying mural. It was difficult to see in a low light, but I squinted to make out the details. The image showed a creature with the same general shape as a bear, but bigger and up on its hind legs. It had a bear's heavy lower body, large round head, and narrow shoulders, but seemed thinner than a bear, nearly emaciated and more at ease upright, as if the artist hadn't been aware that bears ordinarily walk on all fours. The creature's coat, too, was longer than any woodland animal's. Matted black fur, almost like human hair, covered the beast head to toe, except in a few mottled patches that exposed shiny, twisted skin like burned scars. Its face was flatter than a bear's, and a heavy lower jaw, featuring two jutted teeth, hung in a prominent underbite. For whatever perverse reason, the artist had included a shiny dribble of drool at the corner of the creature's mouth. I stared at the image, unmoving for a moment. Once the initial shock wore off, I decided I was too tired to think especially hard about the picture and dismissed it as another product of the same mid-century public works nightmare that had provided the hotel with its tragic name. I crawled back into bed and in a moment slept again. Sunlight directly in my eyes woke me up. Remembering the twisted mural, I made it a point of rolling out of bed the other way before shuffling out of the room. I started my car and drove the short distance back to the visitor center in search of breakfast. I parked amongst a handful of other cars and crossed the gravel lot towards the lobby. A sign for the potluck dining room guided me to breakfast. A hostess sat me at a table in a far corner. Like the Mountain Tap Room, Darkwood covered nearly every surface of the dining restaurant, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the surrounding forest. A handful of other diners sat scattered around the wide room. When the server came around, I ordered eggs and bacon. I enjoyed the view until the food arrived. As she brought my breakfast, though, a familiar face joined her. "Morning, pal." The man from the tap room. "How do you sleep?" His ageless face remained as impassive as ever, but I sensed that he genuinely wanted to know the answer. Like a rock, I answered truthfully. I was pretty toast after the drive, the hike, and the bear yesterday, so I was out pretty quickly. He looked relieved. Glad to hear it. As the man turned to go, I thought of the mural and the twisted bear it had shown. Hey, did your room have one of the murals? He stopped dead. As he turned back to me, I saw that the color had drained completely from his face. Mural? He asked quietly. I could see him thinking. Then he asked the next question carefully. What did yours show? Bear thing. I answered, but a big one with a weird face. He set his jaw and nodded as if he'd hoped that I wouldn't answer in the way I had. He thought again for a moment, and then, as if he'd made up his mind, fixed his expression in a look of grim determination. Without a word, he grabbed my arm, and before I could protest, he hauled me from my seat. Hey man, what? I tried to shake the arm free, but his grip was like steel. The frog marched me across the restaurant as the few other patrons looked on in confusion. He didn't answer, though, as we left the restaurant and crossed the lobby. That same look of determination remained fixed on his ageless face as he led me outside to the door of my car. You need to follow me. He issued the command with authority, and before I could protest or ask just what exactly was happening, he turned and began jogging across the parking lot to a bright red pickup truck. I thought of Big Ben and the old couple, and when he peeled out of the lot, I followed. The red pickup truck sped up as we crossed onto Skyline Drive. Trees, hills, and fall foliage whipped past me as I forced my decrepit SUV to keep pace with a much newer car in front of me. After only a few moments on the road, red and blue lights filled my rear view, and the wail of a siren drowned out the 4Runner's struggling engine. I slowed as what I assumed to be a park ranger approached. A horn blared. I looked again at my window. The ranger drove only a few feet behind me, and I could make out his brick jaw, dark-tinted aviators, and Smokey the Bear hat on the dashboard. He shook his head, waving a hand forward in a keep-going motion. Soon he overtook me, and as he passed, I noticed that he drove not the usual white and green Park Service car, but an unmarked gunmetal gray pickup SUV with a siren mounted to the roof. The ranger passed me in the red truck, siren still blaring. The red pickup crossed into the left lane, and its driver waved for me to pass, indicating that I should continue to follow the ranger. I kept pace with the flashing lights, and the pickup crossed back into the right lane behind me. The three of us continued in this formation for miles, as the ranger led us on a harrowing cannonball run of the scenic highway. The famously winding road twisted and curved through the park, and every time we sped around a curve, I feared that my aging 4Runner would flip. I remember the drive from the park entrance to Skyline taking around an hour. The three of us covered the distance in nearly 20 minutes. The ranger didn't slow until we'd passed the entrance hut. The white and yellow entry barrier was conveniently thrown up by the time we passed. He pulled over to the side of the road once we'd left the park. I did the same, as did the red pickup behind me. The ranger opened the door and stepped out, carrying my backpack. My hands shook as I opened my own door. The terrifying drive had required 100% of my focus, and I'd hardly had a moment to think of what exactly to say. I wanted answers, though. What the hell? I yelled the words at the ranger, gesticulating wildly as I did. He stared, impassive, his expression unreadable behind the tinted aviators. The other man had also stepped from his red pickup and joined us by the side of the road. The two shared a meaningful glance. I looked frantically from one man to the other, searching both of their expressions for some explanation, some reason why I'd been escorted from a national park at 75 miles an hour first thing in the morning. While my belongings sat in my hotel room, the ranger took off his sunglasses and looked me in the eye. The other man put a hand on my shoulder. Both stood in front of me. I stared. You told me about a mural in your room, friend. The gray-eyed man said this slowly, almost sadly. The men shared another look. And the ranger followed up. Pal, the rooms in Skyline don't have artwork. He trailed off, looking to the trees, then turned back to me. Your room didn't have a mural. We locked eyes. It had a window. It took me a moment to process his words. I looked again from one man to the other, but found nothing by way of explanation in either face. The image of the twisted bear creature came to my mind. Its cruel fangs, its long claws, the drool at the corners of its mouth. I thought again of my car, shaking the woods and the black form that had wrapped itself nearly around the vehicle, clawing desperately at its window. My stomach dropped, and I thought for a moment that I might lose my breakfast on the Ranger's boots. The two men stared. Head straight home, pal. The Ranger looked almost sympathetic. And I wouldn't plan any more trips to Shenandoah. He turned towards his car, and the man in flannel followed suit. Wait. My voice cracked as I yelled the final word, but I didn't know what to ask. Do you have my cooler? I finished lamely, and he turned back to me. That's staying in the park, friend. He smiled and shook his head. I hope you didn't have anything too valuable in there. He turned again, and I could tell the conversation was over. The gray-eyed man climbed back into his truck, and as I watched, the two men turned and drove slowly back into the woods. The drive back to Washington was quick. Once I turned off the engine in my old 4Runner, it never started back up again. The bear, or whatever it was, coupled with the furious flight down Skyline Drive, had finally been too much for the old girl. And that night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, high above the noisy streets of the nation's capital, I thought again, more sure this time, that maybe the national parks aren't just there to preserve nature. Yellowstone, he's not far now. Our guide indicated some unseen sign at the base of a nearby pine tree. I nodded my head knowingly and did my best to give the impression that I cared deeply about catching up to the elk. I didn't much like the outdoors anymore. But in grad school, trying to stand out, I made the mistake of putting hiking and exploring the national parks in the intersection of my resume. Much to my chagrin, this inclusion had labeled me an outdoors guy at my job, and when my boss Owen invited me to join a group for a team-building retreat to a hunting lodge in Wyoming, I didn't dare decline. So I found myself hefting a hunting rifle through the Wyoming woods in a light October snow and wanting very badly to return to my cabin. What did you see? Owen's question snapped me out of my rumination. Tracks? The guide responded. Pretty fresh. My boss lit up in a wide smile, eager, no doubt, to return to our group with a trophy. How far do you think he is? Can't say for sure. The guide looked off into the distance. Close enough that we'll keep going on foot. I looked begrudgingly back at the gray pickup truck we'd left behind. Owen, several years older and decidedly soft around the middle, looked equally despondent. We continued through the trees, quiet for a few moments, until Owen's warm baritone again broke the silence. So you've been out here long? The guide chuckled, and deep wrinkles gathered around his eyes. I used to be a ranger, spent 20 years in the parks, including Yellowstone, retired a few years back, and I've been leading trips for Stone Creek ever since. At the guide's mention of our hunting lodge, I thought again of my sumptuously appointed cabin. Something in my face must have betrayed me, because when the guide turned back to us, he shot me the sort of indulgent look that outdoor working types often give inside city folk. How about you boys? Spend much time out this way? Yep, I shot back, mildly offended by his look. My dad was a ranger. I spent a lot of time in the parks as a kid. The guide paused and seemed to reevaluate for a moment. He stared at me as if searching my features, but just as he opened his mouth to speak, Owen interjected with another question. I hear some spooky stories coming out of the parks. My boss looked expectantly back to our guide. People going missing, that sort of thing. Did you ever see anything strange out there? My stomach dropped. A coyote with two snouts flashed through my mind. I tried to keep a neutral expression, though, and the ranger saved me by answering quickly. Oh, sure, you see all kinds of strange things. Kids turn up miles from their parents in places they couldn't have gotten on their own. Hikers hear impossible sounds coming from the trees. That sort of thing. The parks are big, though, and there's a lot of them. So just statistically, some odd stuff is going to happen out here. He waved his hands at this final dismissal in a nothing-to-see gesture. But as he looked from me to Owen, he paused for a moment, and we locked eyes. I knew then that he was lying, and he knew that I knew. And we shared a brief moment of silent understanding that stretched on until Owen interjected again. How your dad ever told you about any of that? He looked at me expectantly, and I tried desperately to concoct some way of ending this line of conversation without being rude to my boss. The guide must have seen my discomfort, though, because he saved me again. Look there. He gestured to the base of another spruce. We're close now. I didn't see anything in the spot he'd indicated. But whether he'd seen a sign or not, the distraction proved effective, and Owen's questions stopped. We continued on again in silence. After only a few moments of blessed quiet, the guide raised a hand and put a finger to his lips. Owen and I stopped in our tracks, pausing at the crest of a hill. The guide pointed into the distance, and I followed his finger. For a while, I saw nothing, and I searched the landscape for some sign of whatever he'd indicated. The Wyoming woods had grown thicker around us, and we'd left the pickup truck behind. The light October snow was beginning to stick, and a thin layer of white had settled amongst the pine needles. The snow wasn't so heavy that I couldn't see clearly, and I scanned the rocky hills below us for some sign of our prey. After a moment of searching, I spotted it. Far in the distance, perhaps a few 100 yards away, a set of antlers peeked out from behind a copse of trees. I grinned, frightened, though I might be now outdoors. I truly loved nature for most of my life, and the prospect of landing a big bull elk still excited me. I turned back to my group. Owen was looking through a set of binoculars, scanning the woods as I had, and the guide waited patiently for him to spot the animal on his own. On cue, the shrill call of a bull elk sounded through the trees. If you've never heard an elk's bugle, the sound is equal parts comical and terrifying. The creatures call out in a high piercing whine that, depending on the animal, can almost sound like a screaming child, the screeching brakes of a poorly maintained car, or the whir of machinery. But the sound is distinctive and unmistakable. You know it when you hear it. Owen looked down from the binoculars, and while I suspected he hadn't spotted our quarry, he seemed satisfied that we were on the right track. Our guide pulled a long tubular call from one of his many pockets and put it in his mouth. As he blew, a similar sound, nearly identical to the call we just heard, echoed forth. His call was followed by another bugle, and the three of us exchanged excited looks. We trekked silently through the trees, down the hill, and towards the spot where we'd seen the antlers, and as we got closer, our guide put up a hand to stop us. "All right," he whispered. "We're getting close enough that we might be able to take this guy. But if anyone asks, we got him a few miles back the way we came from." Oh, and I didn't answer, but our puzzled expressions must have been clear enough because the guide quickly answered our unspoken question. "You're not allowed to hunt in Yellowstone." I think we crossed into parkland about a half-mile back. His words hit like a punch to the stomach. The excitement of the elk hunt evaporated, and I felt only a sinking, creeping dread. Since Shenandoah and a mural that wasn't a mural, I hadn't dared to venture even close to the parks. In fact, I'd done all I could to avoid them, declining invitations to go hiking or camping at every turn. But here I was years later, back in one of the godforsaken national parks. I stopped involuntarily. The guide carried on though, either not noticing or ignoring my reaction. I know all the rangers on duty and neither of y'all would get in trouble, but still it's a hassle I'd rather not deal with. Owen nodded conspiratorially, and I did my best to fix my expression. Apparently I didn't quite manage it though, because Owen weighed in to reassure me. "See, you're not going to get in trouble. I'm sure it happens all the time." He looked to our guide for further reassurance, but the old ranger spotted something in my face that Owen hadn't. He fixed me with the same look he had when I mentioned that my dad had been a ranger. Again, he seemed about to say something, but another bugle cut him off. He turned, and we continued down the hill and into the woods. Slowly, we stopped closer to the elk. Circling around the spot we'd last seen, we approached from behind. At the guide's insistence, we readied our guns. Owen would take the first shot, of course, as he'd financed the entire retreat. I hoped I wouldn't have to follow up, though, because my hands had begun to shake as my fear of the parks took hold. Our boots left faint, nearly invisible tracks, and the thin layer of frost that was now accumulating atop the dirt. Snow has a way of muffling noise, and I could hear only the sounds of our own breath and an increasingly frantic heartbeat. Again, the guide held up his hand, and we stopped. I spotted the antlers again, through the trees. They were closer now, about 100 yards away. I stared fixated as the antlers shifted. I held my breath, and the silent, still woods seemed almost to do the same as I readied myself for the beast to move. Owen knelt and brought the rifle to his shoulder in a practiced motion. The antlers shifted again, All was still. Then, slowly and inexorably, the antlers moved from behind a distant tree, or rather, their owner moved and the antlers came with it. And as the beast came into view, it became clear that whatever the antlers were attached to, it certainly wasn't an elk. The antlers ended in sharp, vicious points that did not seem entirely natural, and grew from a head that seemed to belong to a human or something that had been a human once long ago. The crown of its head was round and entirely bald. Its face had the same general shape of a man's 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a mouth. But where a nose would ordinarily be, it had only a small bulbous snub and 2 snake-like slits. Its eyes, I could see even from a distance, were a cold, piercing blue. Every other part of the creature was bone white, and had it not been for the antlers, I might not have seen it against the snow. The creature was thin, but its limbs were corded with sinewy, ropey muscle. Its torso again looked like something that had once been human, but a human that had been stretched and twisted so as to be almost unrecognizable. Long arms hung nearly to the ground. Beneath an emaciated ribcage hung a distended, protruding belly. Thin, stick legs with backward-facing knees ended in tufts of white fur and large black hoofs. Its enormous hands, tipped with long, filthy nails, held the shredded remains of what looked to have once been a rabbit. The creature, now fully in view from behind the tree, opened its red-stained mouth to reveal rows of long, knife-like teeth. And from that horrifying maw came the shrill, whining bugle of a bull elk. The crack of a rifle sounded through the forest, and the creature's head snapped backwards. I looked back to the ranger, rifle to his shoulder, aiming at the distant horror. I spun my head around, back to the creature as it slowly looked back upwards. And then it turned its head, nearly 90 degrees, to look directly at us. Shit, the ranger's quiet curse snapped me out of my daze. Owen, too, stood out and looked frantically to our guide. In the distance, the beast dropped to all fours. Run. The simple command was all I needed. I turned and bolted back in the direction we'd come from. My rifle jostled uncomfortably against my back, and as I sprinted, I shrugged out of its straps and left it on the path behind me. Ragged breath and pounding footsteps told me that Owen and the guide followed closely behind me. I willed my legs to move faster. Only once briefly did I chance a backward look. The beast had covered the distance between us in impossible time, galloping on all fours in a frenzied, loping sprint. It was so close now that I could see shreds of rabbit in its teeth and across its mouth. The guide sprinted just behind, but as I turned, he paused to lift his rifle again. I saw Owen, too, sprinting behind me, red-faced and laboring up the hill. The abomination was nearly on top of him. I saw the fear in his eyes as he no doubt heard the monster following closely on its heels. The crack of a rifle echoed through the woods. A muffled curse followed shortly after, and Owen's pitiful cry came next. "Help me," he called out, and his warm baritone wavered with fear. I'm ashamed to admit it, but in that moment, a single thought rang clearly through my mind. I didn't have to be faster than whatever was chasing us. I only had to be faster than Owen. And I was. From behind me, a thump, a wet, ripping sound, and a horrific, tortured scream confirmed it. The guide's muffled curse followed. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow. The ranger caught up to me, sprinting to my right, and the look that crossed his face confirmed all that I needed to know. Owen wouldn't be leaving Yellowstone. Alive or dead. A pounding behind me signaled the beast to be done with my boss. For now. We're almost there. The guide screamed his assurance through ragged breath. They can't leave the parks. I thought of a coyote sprinting on its hind legs through the West Texas desert until it stopped dead in its tracks, as if it had hit a wall. And I thought of a desperate hurdle down the Skyline Drive. And I knew that the old ranger was telling the truth. So I sprinted, lungs burning, chest heaving, faster than I'd ever moved in my life toward an invisible finish line in the distance. And I could see it. I can't explain how or why, but I saw it. Only a few yards away. The trees didn't look any different, the ground didn't look any different, but some instinctual part of my brain drew a line through the woods in the distance. And I knew that if I could just make it to that invisible line, I'd be safe. Drawing on reserves I didn't know I had, I sped up. I could hear the beast's pounding hooves. I was so close, I could smell its rotting breath. Yards away, I could feel its labored breathing. It's nearly there. I wasn't going to make it. The abomination's stench, its breath, its pounding feet, they weighed on me like a physical thing, nearly on top of me. I resigned myself to a horrific end when the ranger's piercing yell cut through my panting breath. He collapsed on the ground just in front of me. I reached down mid-stride, hoping desperately that I could help him as I hadn't helped Owen. But as I reached for his arm, I realized that he was grinning. I realized, too, that I could no longer feel the beast behind me. Slowly, I chanced to look backward, and I saw it only a few yards away, still and staring at me. I'd made it. I stopped and stared as the creature turned, stood back on two legs, and sauntered, almost casually, back into the woods. I knew then that the ranger had been correct, that we'd left park property, and that, bound by some law I couldn't properly understand, the creature could not follow. I collapsed next to the ranger. He continued to grin madly as I splayed out, spread-eagled on the dirt. My chest heaved, and I realized dimly that my coat and pants were soaked through with cold sweat. I shook my jacket and lay there for a moment, looking up at the sky as snowflakes spiraled softly down to earth. After a moment, I raised myself to a sitting position. I don't know quite how long we sat there, the ranger and I, staring into the woods, not saying a word. Help me. The desperate cry ripped through the winter air. Help. Again, in a familiar warm baritone, I stood. Help. The ranger stood and put a hand on my chest. Without a word, he shook his head. Sadly, I thought of the elk's bugle that we'd heard through the trees, and I thought of that high animal whine coming from the creature's mouth. And I thought of that tubular call the guide had put to his lips, believing that it was we who lured a wild creature toward ourselves. And I heard the voice call out again, help me. And the guide turned from the woods and walked away, and I followed. We reached the pickup perhaps 15 minutes later. We drove back without a word. The ranger only broke the silence as we pulled up to the ranch. He said only that he'd fixed things with his bosses and my coworkers to explain why Owen hadn't returned. I didn't ask what he meant. Instead, when we got back, I made a beeline for my cabin. I lit a log in the fireplace. I made a cup of coffee. I shed my clothes and left them in a pile on the floor. And I gathered a blanket around myself, and I sat in front of the fire, and I wept. Sometime later, perhaps only minutes, perhaps hours, a knock interrupted my sobs. I dried my face on the blanket and hastily pulled myself together. I opened the door to find the familiar, lined face of our guide. He cocked his head in a come-this-way motion, and I followed him outside. The two of us sat together side by side in the rocking chairs out front of my cabin. We rocked back and forth for a moment, neither of us quite ready to break the silence. The old ranger spoke first. "What's your last name, son?" I told him. He nodded as if he'd been expecting my answer. "I figured you were old Danny's boy." I turned to him, shocked equally by his casual reference to my father, and by the fact that after the day's events, I was even capable of shock. "You look just like him." I thought about the night my dad hadn't come back. I didn't respond for a while. Then, slowly, almost resigned, I asked, "What the hell, man?" I wrapped all my questions into the one, the coyote, the bear, the elk thing. With that single question, I asked about all of it. So he told me, and he didn't know much more than I did. But that night, as I cocooned myself in the cabin's sumptuous bedding, I figured that it was like this. We learn in school that the parks preserve nature. They keep people out to prevent them from spoiling the natural beauty. But that's not all they do. Somehow, by some law I can't understand, the parks keep things in as well. And like an old couple in Big Bend, like a gray-eyed man in Shenandoah, like my guide, and like my dad, I was going to help keep it that way. "Oh, Royal, how far are we?" The roar of the small boat's twin motors, coupled with the howling storm, nearly drowned out my voice, and I had to shout to be heard over the din. About 1.5 miles, the captain's poncho whipped loosely about his body, and he squinted into the wind. Just as I opened my mouth to respond, the Park Service boat crashed into a wave. I slipped on the rain-slicked deck and stumbled backwards as a spray of freezing lake water stung my eyes. A handrail saved me from going over the edge. As I turned to huddle closer under the small awning, I found the captain, hair streaming, laughing at my display. His mouth moved and I heard the deep timbre of his voice, but in the commotion, whatever he'd said was lost to the wind. "What?" I yelled, but the noise drowned me out. The captain just shook his head, giving up as I had on any hope of conversation. I followed his lead and turned my eyes forward. Our royal grew large in the distance. A crash of thunder and bolt of lightning lit up the far-off pines. Twin beams of light illuminated in the late afternoon storm shone through the rain to signal the approaching shoreline. We rounded a jagged edge of rock into a long natural harbor, and the straight lines of man-made construction came slowly into focus. The captain slowed. "Is there anyone at the lodge?" I shouted the question, hopeful that I could now be heard over the storm and the motors. "Damn, son, you don't have to shout." He bobbed his head backward as if struck by my voice. "Sorry," I repeated the question more softly. "Is anyone stationed at the lodge?" "No." He kept his eyes on the shoreline ahead. "Staff is home for the winter. The park's been officially closed for weeks." I didn't respond, but my chattering teeth betrayed me. "We've got the generator running. You won't freeze to death." As if on cue, a blast of wind howled across the bow and stole the breath from my lungs. The frozen gust seemed to cut straight through my clothing, but if the captain felt the cold, he didn't react. A line of ragged wooden docks and a vaguely human form materialized in the distance. The captain guided the craft slowly towards the shore as our waiting companion came into view. "Joey?" A familiar voice called out as we slided up to the wood. Its owner ambled toward us in a shambling half-limp. The captain handed me a rope, and as we got close enough, I tossed it toward the dock. A splash, followed by a disappointed grunt, informed me that I'd missed. I hauled the dripping and now much heavier line back on board. Our guide had reached the boat by now, and he placed a leathery hand on the gunwale. "Get off that tub and tie her up." He gave the command in a familiar rasping grumble, and I scrambled to follow his orders. As I climbed the side of the boat, I paused briefly with my foot above the dock. But before I could think better of once again setting foot on national park land, a choppy lake made my decision for me. A wave rocked the boat, and the motion pitched me face down onto the dock. A chorus of old man laughter followed. I lifted myself to my knees, and a calloused hand reached down. I took it, and with surprising strength, the old guide hauled me to my feet. The Rangers should be getting to Wendigo about now. The name of the other smaller harbor across the island brought to mind for a moment a snowy October day and the last time I'd seen the guide. The two of them stared at one another until a question from the boat interrupted my reverie. "So, this kid, like you said." The captain climbed from the boat to join us, frost clinging stubbornly to his beard. "Pretty sure." The two old men shook hands. "Let's hope so." The captain took the rope, which, to that point, I've been holding limp in my shivering hands. He tied up the boat in a single practiced motion, and the three of us started toward a lit building in the distance. Inside, the guy provided me with a new dry set of clothes, a heavy canvas jacket, pants, and a thick cable-knit sweater. I changed and did my best to warm up and dry off. 20 or so minutes later, I sat at a chipping with laminate table with a steaming cup of coffee. I pulled on a pair of wool socks and laced up my duck boots as the old men joined me. "How was the trip in?" I stared at the guide vacantly. My drowned rat visage seemed to provide an answer enough because he dropped the question. "What's happening on the other side of the island?" The captain got straight to the point. The guide set his coffee on the table. He looked us both in the eye. "Those folks are cornered." He stared into the mug. "The Rangers ought to be with them by now, but they can't get anywhere." I thought the park was closed. "It is." The guide shook his head. "But every year there's a few hikers that think the rules don't apply to them. They take a private boat out to the island, and they get themselves stuck." He told me as much on the phone that morning before the government escorted Mad Dash from my DC apartment to the middle of nowhere, Michigan, but I still didn't completely understand the situation. "Okay, so why can't they just wait until the storm lets up?" I let the question trail off. The ranger looked up and we locked eyes. "Do you think I would have called you?" "About a storm." I thought of a twisted coyote with blue eyes too similar to my own. I thought of my forerunner and her last desperate sprint down Skyline Drive, and I all but heard the whining bugle of a bull elk, and I didn't have an answer. What's the plan? He told me. I didn't like it. Our boat idled at the edge of the park's natural harbor. The captain had flicked on its powerful spotlight to illuminate the surrounding water, and the twin engines burbled eagerly. Neither I nor the captain spoke, but he wore a look of grim determination that I can only aspire to. I held my blue hat in front of me, ringing its battered bill this way and that. If I didn't, I knew my hands would be shaking. A burst of static across the captain's radio interrupted my nervous fiddling. The guide's voice crackled through. "We're moving. Time to go." The captain didn't waste any time. The puttering engines roared to life, and the small park service craft shot forward. My hat nearly flew from my hands, and I put it on backwards to keep it from flying away. I gripped tightly to an upright handhold and squinted into the wind. The storm had mostly let up and the water was placid, but a thick fog had settled in over the lake and visibility wasn't much better now than it had been earlier in the evening. The frozen wind still stung. We rounded the jagged edge of the harbor, and the captain aimed the boat toward Michigan. All I could do was hold on for dear life and wait, and I didn't have to wait long. In the distance, through the gathering fog, I spotted it. It looked at first like the wake of a fast-moving motorboat, twin waves cresting in white foam. But there was no boat. I pointed it out to the captain. He nodded and set his jaw, but didn't say anything. I turned back to the phantom wake. Now, at its peak, I saw a shadow just beneath the water. The shadow of something massive, hurtling towards us. Once in college, a friend had taken me to visit his family in Miami. We'd gone out on his dad's speedboat. The craft had flown across the water fast enough to take my breath away. The shadow and its wake were moving faster. The captain kept his hands steady and the throttle forward. I turned back to the water. The wake was gone and the shadow with it. I let out a deep breath I didn't know I'd been holding and relaxed my grip on the handrail. He handed me a cup of coffee, and I noticed vaguely that the sun shone through the lighthouse's small window. Cap told me what happened. I sipped my coffee. 5 people are alive because of what you did. He fixed me with an intense stare, and I looked up. Those folks were on parkland without permission, and well, they wouldn't have been allowed to leave. Not until you showed up. I nodded, and we sat in silence for a few moments. I sipped my coffee, and he looked mildly out the window. After a while, I asked the question that had plagued my mind since Yellowstone. Why do those things come after me? I stared into my coffee as I asked. Can't say for sure. I searched for the old man's worn features. But if you want to hear what I think. He trailed off, then turned back to me. I think it has something to do with your father. My dad, I looked up, suddenly alert. We locked eyes, and then slowly, carefully, he told me, your dad is the only person that ever killed one of them. Mammoth Caves. Your dad is the only person that ever killed one of them. I sank back into the sofa, coffee cooling and forgotten, as I processed the old guide's words. Then I said, tell me. And in his slow, careful croak of a drawl he did. Your old man and I were both members of the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch. If you ask 100 people, 99 don't know the parks have their own little FBI. But they do, and you can imagine what that job entailed. One day, in the dead heat of summer, a call comes through the Washington office. A kid went missing in Mammoth Cave. Something didn't smell right, and they wanted one of our boys on it. So a couple hours later, the two of us find ourselves driving a banged-up Park Service cop car through the Kentucky woods with our sirens blaring. When we got to the cave entrance, the ranger in charge, a big hulk of a guy, met us out front. That place is eerie during the best of times, but that day was another story. There's this long concrete staircase that cuts down the hill into the mouth of the cave. Now, stairs in the woods are always a bad sign, but these, they look almost like the ground is swallowing the steps whole. On top of that, the place was crawling with rangers, and the entire scene gave me a bad feeling. What did they tell you? The big guy asks us, cutting right to the chase. Truth was not much, so he filled us in. Robbie Abbott, 6 years old, he's on summer vacation and his parents take him for a tour of the caves. He pointed to a young couple sitting on the stairs all huddled together. The Abbotts go in around 10 a.m. 10 a.m., Mrs. Abbott comes out panicked. She flags down the nearest ranger and tells him their boy went missing and that Mr. Abbott is still inside looking for him. 15 comes out with Mr. Abbott, but no sign of the kid. Eventually, Mr. and Mrs. calm down, but it took a while. Once they start giving details, things stop adding up. According to the Abbotts, they were in a side cave just off the main path. And Mr. Abbott was holding little Robbie's hand. He turns to Mrs. Abbott, and while the two of them are chatting, he lets go for a minute. They turn back, and little Robbie is gone. No trace, like he melted right into the rocks. As we spoke, I could tell the Abbotts were listening in, so we thanked the big ranger and went over to the couple. The two of them seemed pretty broken up. They told us exactly the same story they'd given the big guy. After doing a side path, the kid lets go of Mr. Abbott's hand. Then he's gone without a trace. But the mom mentioned that their boy was wearing his brand new pair of red light-up shoes, which the ranger hadn't mentioned. Your dad and I talked privately for a minute. We agreed. Something seemed funny, but we decided to ask if they could show us the place where it happened. When we asked the couple, Mr. Abbott puts on a brave face and says, "I'll go." And the big ranger agreed to let him show us the spot, but he insisted on coming with us as well to make sure we didn't get ourselves lost. So we each took a lantern, and the four of us went down that staircase and into the cave. The guide paused here for a moment and sighed heavily. Then he stood and crossed the small living room to a corner cabinet. After rustling inside for a moment, he came away with a tall amber bottle. Still silent, he poured a few swallows of the stuff into his coffee, then returned liquor in hand to his place on the chair. He offered me the bottle. I was still cold to my bones from my trip to AO Royal, so I accepted and poured a bit into my own mug. Then the old man continued, "I said earlier that the mouth of that cave is eerie and the best of times. Well, these weren't the best of times. The entrance looks like a big black hole in the earth, and it always seems to be dripping, even on a clear summer day like that one. It's always cool down there, chilly even. And for whatever reason, there's always a breeze blowing out of the cave. Out of the cave, not into it. So when we went down those stairs into the earth, I had this creeping sensation, like I was walking into my own grave. Once we got inside, Abbott and the ranger led us on a quick march through the caves. We took a right out of the entrance and ended up in a cavern so big they built a staircase in it. Things go back and forth in a zigzag 4 or 5 times. They call it the tower. The entryway and a lot of the more developed areas are hung with these electric lights, so the tower is lit up like the front, but gets darker as you go down. We took a left off of that staircase, but after that, I can't tell you where we went. I did my best to backtrack, but I figured we had the lead guy with us and he knew his way around. After a while, maybe 20 to 30 minutes of walking, Mr. Abbott stopped us and said it was here. The electricity had ended a few turns prior, so we only had light from our lanterns. Cave dark is a different kind of dark. Usually you can see outlines and movement. Down there, under the rocks, it presses in on you like it's a living thing. So it seemed awfully strange that someone would bring their kid down one of these ways. But we got to looking around. Your old man asked the ranger and Mr. Abbott stepped back, and we scanned the ground for any sign of the kid. But after at least half an hour of looking, the two of us hadn't turned up one trace of that boy. Your dad asked Mr. Abbott if he was positive this is where it had happened. He said he was quite sure. Then, after your dad asked the question, he turned back around and held his lantern up high. And Abbott got right up behind him, inches away. I can still see the picture, clear as I'm seeing you. The man had gone pale, ghost white. In his eyes, some animals have this reflective layer behind their eyeballs. It's why you can see a cat's eyes in the dark. But humans don't have it. It's why you can get red eye in a camera flash. There's something behind our eyeballs, so the light goes right through, and you can actually see the capillaries in the blood. But when your dad held up that lantern, Abbott's eyes flashed yellow-green, like an animal's. My stomach dropped, but before I could say anything to your old man or even tell Abbott to back up, we heard something echoing around the cave. I shushed everyone, and we all waited, silent and huddled around. Then we heard it again. It was more clear the second time. Hello. It was a high panicked shout, like a lost little kid. It had to be Robbie. I'd all but forgotten about Abbott and his creepy eyes, so I called back. Robbie, I yelled. Robbie, we're here to help you. Who's there? The voice called out again, excited but still scared. Robbie, I tell him we're park rangers. Your dad is here with us. I nudged Abbott, and he called out too. He says, Robbie, it's Dad. We're coming to get you. Keep yelling and stay where you are. And the four of us went deeper into the caves, following that voice. After a bend through dark in the distance, I spotted a pair of blinking, flashing red lights just a few inches off the ground, like a little kid's light-up shoes. The four of us dashed toward him into the dark, but they kept getting farther away, like Robbie was running. We kept calling, though, and he kept answering. The ranger and Abbott got ahead of us. Abbott couldn't be slowed, and the ranger kept up with him. Your dad and I fell a bit behind as the two of them turned a sharp corner ahead of us. The tunnel had gotten tighter. We had to go one by one now, and the both of us were crouching down. But when we rounded the bend, we came right up on a big pile of rocks in our way. There was only a small gap set a bit off of the ground, and we'd have to go through at an angle. I held up my lantern, but couldn't see much past the rocks. We called out, and the ranger's voice answered, through here. I tried to picture a big guy like him squeezing through that tiny gap, but I figured he had plenty of experience in the caves and didn't think much more about it. Then your dad says to me, I'll go first. He didn't wait for me to agree, he just started climbing, and before I knew it, he'd squeezed right through that gap. I waited for a beat. Then, from the other side, he gave a shout and I heard a clatter of rocks. I rushed to squeeze through after him and climbed up the rocks. I got my head and shoulder into the gap, then tried to use my feet to push the rest of my body through after. I wasn't sure I was going to make it, and for a moment I was properly stuck. My heart started going as the rocks felt like they were squeezing me. But after a beat, my uniform shifted and I got through. It took me a moment to get my bearings on the other side. I held up my lantern, and the cavern was so big, I couldn't see the walls. I thought I heard the rush of water somewhere nearby, but I can't be sure. Your dad was just ahead of the gap, and he had his lantern held up high, but he was just standing there. Danny, I said to him, what's going on? Do we have a kid? He didn't answer. He was looking at something on the ground. So I came up next to him and I saw what he was looking at. It makes my stomach churn just thinking about it. On the ground was the ranger or parts of him. The only word I can think of to describe that mess was a pile. The ranger was in a wet, shredded pile on the cave floor. And on top of that pile, stacked neatly almost, was a pair of blinking red light-up shoes. There was no sign of Abbott. I stopped and stood next to your dad and just stared for a minute, until a voice interrupted us. Over here. It was the kid's voice again, but it echoed and bounced off the walls of the cavern so loud that I couldn't tell where it came from. Then again, but a different voice. We're over here. Mister. Abbott's this time. I stepped deeper into the cave and pulled my flashlight from my belt, and I shined it all around that cave. Your dad made it sound like he was going to answer, but I stopped him because my light hit something moving by the cave wall. I tried to follow it, but it lost me. Your dad kept his lantern up in one hand and pulled his own flashlight out in the other. He shined it all around the cave too, and then two things happened, one right after the other. First, the kid's voice called out again, hello? And second, my light found what the voice came from, and it sure as hell wasn't Robbie Abbott. Clinging to the wall, high up in the cavern, was a pale white thing. Its body was long, shapeless, and fleshy, like some kind of overgrown maggot. It hung onto the wall with four thin, double-jointed arms that stuck to the rocks with these long, almost human fingers in its face. It had two beady little black eyes on either side of a big round head, and in between them were two long, jagged slits, nostrils, I assume. But most of that head was a mouth, a giant mouth filled with needles for teeth. And when I shined my light over its eyes, they flashed yellow-green like an animal. And when it opened that mouth, Robbie's voice came out again and said, "Who's there?" I froze, and all I could do was stare, until another voice from somewhere else in the cave called out, "Over here in Mr. Abbott's voice," and then another through here in the Rangers. Then a chorus of voices sounded from all around us. Louder and louder, echoing off the walls. I heard the Ranger. I heard Mr. Abbott. I heard little Robbie. And then I heard a woman shrieking loudly, "Where's my son?" And I heard the heaving sobs of a little kid. And I heard all three of those voices screaming, crying, and screeching through the caves, like they were being torn apart. That was enough for me. I shouted at your dad, told him to go, and he did. I got a little deeper into the cavern when I was shining my light around, and your dad was closer to the gap we'd come through. He bolted toward it, and around us, the skitter and crawl of fingers against rock seemed to come from every direction as those awful voices echoed and bounced off the walls. Your dad squeezed through the gap, then I followed him. I climbed up, and again I got my head and shoulders through, but I couldn't get my chest or my midsection past those rocks. I pushed off the walls again, but I couldn't get a good enough angle. The skittering sound and those echoing voices seemed like they were right behind me. And again, the rocks felt like they were crushing me down. But your dad got a hold of my vest and he yanked me right through. Just when I felt the brush of fingers against my ankles, the both of us took off. I couldn't for the life of me remember where we'd come from, but your dad did. And we flew through those caves. All the while that skittering sound and those voices wailing followed us just on our heels. We reached the tower, and the both of us took the stairs 2 at a time. When we reached the entrance, I was breathing heavily, and whatever I had chased seemed to be gone. I stopped, and for a second I looked back into the cave, and I could swear I saw a pair of flashing yellow-green eyes right behind us. But I turned back around, and by then your dad was already out of the cave and halfway to Mrs. Abbott. He says to her, "Ma'am, for your safety, you have to come with us." She protested, of course, asked where her husband was, where her son was, but your dad stayed quiet, and all he would say is, "Please come this way," while he marched her to the car and put her in the back. I wasn't quite sure what he was thinking, but I knew that I trusted your dad. And so I got in the passenger seat while he threw on the sirens and we hightailed out of that park. Once we got going, she kept firing questions at us from back there. "Where are you taking me? Where's my husband? Where's my boy?" Then we couldn't answer. But when we got close to the exit, with the ranger booth in the distance, she really started to lose it. She started screeching and started wailing. I tried to tell her to keep calm, that everything was going to be okay. By now, we were going about 60. And when I turned around, what I saw was not a scared mother. She'd gone pale, just like her husband had in the cave, and her neck seemed too long now, and she started thrashing and kicking at the window, and her voice started to change too. First it was her own scared mother routine, then the quiet heaving sobs of a lost little kid, then the angry shout of a grown man, and then, just as we were about to cross out of the park with some animal strength that I have never seen anywhere else, she kicked right through the safety glass cop car window and launched herself out. Your dad slammed on the brakes, and I damn near went through the windshield. She landed a few yards away. Your dad sprinted over to her, and I scrambled to unbuckle my seatbelt and follow him. By the time I got there, the two of them were wrestling on the ground. Her mouth had gotten twice the size of a human's, and those teeth had gone needlely sharp. And the two of them were rolling on the asphalt, her kicking, screaming, and snapping those jaws, and him huffing to wrestle her down. She got her teeth into him, bit him real bad on the shoulder, right near his throat. But your dad hauled that thing to the ranger's booth, and she fought him for every inch. And by the time he got her there, she'd gone all the way back to one of those fleshy, maggot-y things we'd seen down there underground. But he dragged her over the edge of the park, just by a bit. And when he did, that thing stopped dead still, and let out this awful, high-piercing wail, somewhere between a bobcat scream and metal scraping down an old chalkboard. Then, like a plant dying in double time, she withered to a brown shriveled husk. Then a breeze blew in, and she floated away like dust in the wind. We got your dad fixed up. Then we called our office that afternoon, and your dad told them everything that happened. Every word. The Abbotts never turned up, but I can guarantee there wasn't a thing about it in the news. And if you ask around, nobody's going to tell you a thing. The guide let his final line trail off into a whisper. He'd barely moved throughout the story, but when he finished, he sunk into the chair, deflated, as if the tale had drained him of some essential life energy. Finally, after a long pause, we locked eyes, and in his dry croak, voice nearly gone, the old man finished. You want to know why those things came after you? He took a final sip of his coffee. Your dad dragged one of them, kicking and screaming out of the parks with his bare hands. And I don't think they can just forget about that. Yosemite, you'll be safe here tonight. The old guide nodded firmly as he spoke, and I wondered for a moment whether he meant to encourage me or himself. You're sure? My voice trembled, but I swallowed my fear and matched the other man's gaze. We don't know much about him, but we know they can't leave the parks, and we know they can't get inside ranger property. I thought for a moment about a 2 tall bear standing outside my window in Shenandoah, and I nodded. I won't be back until the morning. He turned toward the ranger cabin's door, then paused for a moment with his hand on the knob. If we get those folks out of here, kid, it'll be because of you. The old man pushed the door open and walked into the waning golden light of the late afternoon. After a moment, I heard the rumble of his pickup truck and then the scatter of pebbles. Then through the window, I watched him pull away. I bolted the door and turned the knob's lock. The small ranger's hut offered little in the way of entertainment. Its wood-paneled walls were adorned only by the large window next to a fireplace. Against the opposite wall sat a brown leather couch, faded and worn no doubt by generations of rangers. Past the living room, a wood fire stove took up most of the kitchen, and a Spartan bedroom contained only a cot. The window at least offered a view. Past the cabin's gravel driveway, I looked out the glass to the edges of a dense forest as the sinking summer sun shone bright through the trees. I tried to keep busy at first and found small meaningless tasks to occupy my time. I set a fire in the fireplace. I chopped up some vegetables. I swept the cabin's already pristine floor. As I worked, I allowed myself to entertain the notion that perhaps the night would go on without disruption. But when I sunk into the faded couch with a book, I knew deep down I wouldn't be so lucky. I struggled to focus. Words seemed to dance around the pages, and I reread the same passages over and over. Soon I gave up and flipped open my computer. It came as no surprise that the little ranger cabin didn't have Wi-Fi, but in this part of the valley I had enough cell service to use my phone's hotspot. So I connected and scrawled half-heartedly through the news. It was, as it always seems to be these days, bad. Out of curiosity, I paged through the park websites. Across the country, they've been opening and closing to varying degrees and with all sorts of conditions. It was this confused set of rules that brought me to Yosemite and again to the parks. When the old guide called me, I'd not been surprised, more confused rather, that he hadn't called sooner. The patchwork of rules had led to confusion amongst hikers, campers, and those who enjoyed the outdoors. So inevitably, some people ended up in places they didn't have permission to be, and they ran afoul of the things that called the parks home. A knock on the door jolted me from the screen. My heart leapt to my throat, and I looked through the window to see that the sun had now sunk beneath the trees. I got carefully to my feet and crossed the small living room. The knock came again. Who's there? I called through the door, and my voice again shook. It's me, kid. Open up. The guide's croaking drawl sounded muffled and annoyed from the other side. I let out a deep breath, but as I reached for the bolt with my hand on the cool metal slider, I paused. The captain's door didn't have a peephole, but through the window on the far wall where I'd watched him drive away, I saw no sign of the guide's aging pickup, and I thought of a bull elk's bugle echoing through Yellowstone. I pulled my hand from the bolt, and I stepped back. The voice came again through the door. What's the hold up, kid? Warily, I responded. You were a guide in Wyoming. What was the name of the ranch? There was a long pause from the other side. You serious, kid? The voice sounded exasperated now. It was still the guide's slow, creaking drawl, but there was something ragged and strained about it. I stayed silent, unmoving by the door. Then the voice came again, but different this time. No longer the guide's steady baritone, the voice sounded now like the impression of a human performed by something that had heard people talk, but didn't have the right vocal cords to produce human speech. Or like the words were compiled from sound clips and played through whiny, rattling speakers. Have it your way. I heard the crunch of gravel as whatever produced that voice walked away, first with a steady impact of 2 feet, then with a skittering scramble of several. I managed to steady my breathing and to drop back to the couch. Studying the door for a moment, I wondered just how sure the ranger had been when he promised the cabin was safe. I wondered, too, what the park would throw at me next. As to the first question, I still can't be sure. As to the second, I had only to wait a few moments. Through the window on the far wall of the cabin, I spotted the tiny form of a child crawling from the darkened edge of the forest. Please, please help me. I couldn't make out the kid's face, but I could hear his voice clearly enough, and it sounded tortured and scared. For the briefest of moments, some part of me thought that maybe this really was a child seriously hurt, and maybe I should go outside and help him. But as the form dragged itself from the woods, I dismissed that notion because the kid didn't have legs. The back half of him, below the waist, was just a formless mass of blue, roughly the color of denim, and it seemed to smear on the ground as the kid dragged himself onward. I shook my head and stood to pull the blinds closed. Whatever impersonated the kid must have realized its performance was unconvincing, because as I stood, the child's form lifted itself on 2 hands, and faster than should have been possible, it used them to scramble back into the woods. I turned my eyes briefly to the door to make sure the bolt was still locked. And when I turned back to the window, the thing was right there. The pale figure kept the general shape of a human, but only just. It had all the right features, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. But nearly every one of those features was wrong somehow. The head itself was too big, round, broad, and fleshy. It lacked any definition of the sort that would come from a human skeleton. Instead, it looked like a ball of clay that a child half-heartedly shaped into a face, then stuck to a sculpture. Its eyes, tiny, beady, and all black, were set wide on either side of the formless head. Its mouth, no more than a razor-thin gash cut across the broad width of the too big face. But its nose somehow was flawless, like the creature had mastered a single aspect of human anatomy and replicated it perfectly. As I reached the window, the thing pressed its horrifying face up against the glass, and I could only stare, frozen, at the horror in front of me. Then, all of a sudden, it snapped its head back towards the woods, towards something moving behind it, and I could swear that, just for a moment, it looked scared. Soon I saw what had frightened the beast. From the ragged edge of the forest, what looked like a man emerged slowly into the light. He had a long mane of gray hair, though he seemed to have done his best to tie it back neatly. His beard, too, was overgrown, but again it had the look of some effort at maintenance and care. He strode, calm and confident, toward the little ranger's cabin, and the thing at my window bolted. The man seemed hardly to notice, and as he got closer, I forgot about the beast that had, until that moment, frozen me solid, because all the old man's features came more sharply into view, and I met his piercing blue eyes, the exact same shade as my own. I realized that I recognized him. I recognized the man who had struck fear into one of the things that haunted the parks. Still not sure it was true, I said aloud, "Dad?" And the old man just smiled. It was all too much to process. In a matter of minutes, I'd seen one of those things change from a tortured, mangled little kid to a horror show of a clay doll nightmare. Then my father, years since presumed dead, had wandered out of the forest and scared it away. He came around to the front door, wary still of those nightmares and their tricks. In a shaky voice, I tried desperately to come up with a question that only my dad could answer. "Would you give me for my 16th birthday?" "A gray forerunner," he answered calmly. "Does that thing still run?" I spluttered and tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Fortunately, the old man spoke again, and I didn't have to fill the silence. "Listen, I know every trick those things pull. If I was you, I probably wouldn't let me in either. So how about we sit and we talk? And if you decide I'm me and not one of them, you let me in whenever you please." Still, at a loss for words, I nodded, and then realized that he couldn't see me. So I managed a pathetic, "Okay." I sunk down against the cabin door. Outside, I heard him do the same, and we sat like that for hours, just talking. I told him about my life, where I'd been, what I'd seen. At one point, I even grabbed my computer from its place on the couch and read him a few of my stories from the parks, and he told me a bit too. And I dozed off there somewhere, and he did the same. I can hear his snores now through the door as I type out this post. Hearing that old man's wheezing again feels like traveling back in time to the late nights and weekend mornings of my childhood to a simple, easy, happy time. Over those hours of conversation, I hadn't been sure. I hadn't been 100% positive. But when I heard those snores, I knew, and I know now the man outside is my dad. July 31st. I suppose I should tell you I'm not the kid that wrote this story here. He called me the guide, so I suppose you folks can call me that too. I read through most of what the kid wrote. He changed some details around. Mostly, it seems like so nobody could figure out who he was. Everything else, though, it's all true. Sorry to say, you might have noticed I said it was. See, when I came back today, ready to pick the kid up and talk about the lives he'd saved, the cabin was empty. No sign of the kid and no sign of the old man. The only thing I found was a backpack with a change of clothes and his computer. So I guess it's up to me to finish the story. I wish I could tell you all just what happened to the kid, but I don't know. Maybe the person outside that door really was his old man. Maybe the two of them are off in the woods together now. But I don't think so. So if you ever go to Yosemite and you see a hiker with piercing blue eyes and a navy hat pulled down low, and if when he talks to you, he talks in a deep rumbling voice, well, I think it's best if you don't answer. Because I can tell you this much. The national parks aren't just there to preserve nature. Hey everyone, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the story. And I wanted to give a special thank you to the author, Count of Cristomani. I was called out on an emergency dive on the 12th of April 2013. Back then I usually did forensic and rescue dives, but this was something different entirely. Usually I want to get called out. Time is a definite and measurable factor. For example, someone could be in mortal danger, or there's a time-sensitive object that needs to be retrieved. This time the objective wasn't clear. My first impression was that this was something catastrophic. I was called up in the middle of the night with no warning, and there was talk of a measurable geological event. I wasn't briefed, and every person involved just stonewalled me with a barrage of I don't know. I knew pretty much anyone who worked on my level statewide, but these people were just gray-faced, anonymous nobodies. They drove me all the way to Greenbrier Valley. Just imagine this middle of nowhere dirt road covered by government-issued vehicles. Off the top of my head, I registered people from the USACE, United States Army Corps of Engineers, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the EPA, the United States Geological Survey, and the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. Those were just the ones I recognized. But at least half of the vehicles were unmarked or straight up. I swear one of them claimed to be a dam catering business. I was pushed through a crowd of people. Some were screaming at their phones. Others were screaming at one another. There was this one red-faced middle-aged man almost crying with frustration at a young woman. He kept waving his papers at her, and all she did was nod and smile somewhere along the line. People started asking me questions. What's the ETA on your prep? Did you bring your own gear? Are you signed in? Where's the sign-in? There were other people I'd worked with on site. There was Garrett, who just turned 44, and Nora. I'd worked with Nora on a couple of rescue dives, but nothing on this scale. There were a few faces in the crowd that I vaguely recognized, but Garrett and Nora stood out. They were already suiting up. They were preparing for a cold dive and checking their equipment. I had some papers shoved in my hands. As I signed in, I could see a bubble of people forming around one of the USACE representatives and an older woman in a professional pantsuit. "You got 12 hours," said the woman in the pantsuit. Not a second longer. "This is private property." Garrett waved me over, and I sat down on a log next to him. I started to dress down. "Someone needs to talk to me," I said. "Someone tell me what's going on." "Earthquake," said Nora. "Not a big one, but yeah, what the hell does this have to do with an earthquake?" I asked. It's the lake, said Garrett. You'll see. Still putting on my gear, we were pushed forward. They took me by the arm and forced me on, drowning me in questions along the way. When we finally stepped through a forest clearing, what was supposed to be a small lake opened up on us. Except it wasn't a lake anymore. The water had been drained, leaving only a bed of dirt behind. Hundreds of seagulls picking at dying fish in a cacophony of screeches. Men in hazmat suits were trying to chase them off, but only ended up slipping back and forth on the mud. In the middle of a dreamed lake was a hole about 6 by 4 feet. It was the only space that still retained water. There were tables set up around it, along with security tape and red flags. About a dozen people spread out around a dozen laptops, making calculations and checking measurements. An anonymous woman popped up next to us, pushing us forward. I could sense the warmth of the sun on the horizon. About an hour from dawn. We're doing a blind dive, she said. We need you to be in constant communication with us about anything you see. You'll be going in within the hour. We're not doing that, said Garrett. There's no emergency here. There's no. Suddenly, Garrett came tumbling into the mud. The woman had pushed him. You're doing this, she snarled. You're doing it. We're not doing shit until we get it. You see that? She interrupted Garrett, pointing to the army of vehicles. That right there is a sworn oath that I will burn your damn life to the ground. You cocky son of a bitch, now you do this, or you'll never touch a glass of water again. Nora helped Garrett up, and we hurried down to the hole. I could barely hear anything over the feasting seagulls. I was thankful for the rubber mask keeping me from the smell of dead fish. 2 men tried their best to prepare the basics, but we had nothing. There was basically no dive plan, no idea about the temperature, the stability, the currents, nothing. These people were completely clueless. The only thing they could answer was the size of what we were getting into. The small quake had revealed a sprawling cave system, which the lake water had drained into. Roughly 350 feet wide and 700 feet deep, all underground. I tried my best to wrap my head around it. We tested our Colink masks and settled on individual tracking lines. We'd be diving for 20 minutes, then set aside 25 for resurfacing and depressurizing. We'd be having air tanks on rotation and constant contact with those up at the control at the slightest hint of trouble. We'd bail, no questions asked. There was no way we'd go in blind for any longer than that. We'd agreed on resurfacing if there was a comms malfunction, even though we all knew hand signals by heart. This couldn't go wrong on any level. We were still setting up when we were given hand chisels and self-sealing bags. We want samples of everything, they told us. Everything. Now let's try to put this in perspective. At this point, we barely knew anything. An earthquake had revealed a cave system on some kind of company property. The size and depth of this was unfathomable. In 12 hours, we'd be kicked off the site, possibly so they could perform their own tests. This cave system had been completely isolated, possibly for tens of thousands of years. Someone even kept throwing around the term Karoo Ice Age, but that seemed improbable. This place would either be a unique resource or a complete waste of time. We were at least 1 to 2 hours in on the countdown when we first dipped our toes in the water. It was much colder than anticipated. As I sat on the edge, dangling my feet in the murky water, one of the on-site technicians double-checked my air tanks. It's exciting, isn't it? He smiled. I'm jealous. How come? I asked. You get to explore, he chuckled. An actual space that no human eyes have ever seen before. That's not always a good thing, nodded Nora. And there's plenty of that on the ocean floor. We took that first plunge. I could barely see anything because of the mud and the reeds, so we just went straight down. The water got colder with every foot, and little dust particles whizzing past me made it feel like driving through a rainstorm. As we got further down, the sense of unease settled in my chest. I'd never been so ill-prepared for a dive, and this was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. There's a reason why people are advised to stay out of underwater caves. This was, in more ways than one, uncharted waters. We went down about 25 feet, where we finally hit rock bottom. The cave wall was rough and sharp, with some kind of thin crystal layer. So, I figured. Nora got a sample as anonymous voices buzzed in our ears. I could barely make out half of it. All right, go deeper. A voice came through. We mapped out 3 different tunnels leading further down. The first one we checked turned out to be so thin my equipment risked snagging on the walls. We backed out and tried another tunnel until we found one large enough. Still, it was more like crawling than swimming. Turtle 1, we're getting seismic. A voice came through. Please respond. Stand by equalizing. I could feel the mechanism from the camera on my shoulder roaring. Garrett came through on the local channel. No way the signal sticks. Granite and quartz. This is pointless. Resurface in 10, I said. Check for samples in the cracks. The tunnel led us to a small cave. The water was less murky, but the space was only about 15 by 20 feet and at most 6 feet high. It was enough for us to regroup, check our tethers, and take a few samples. Nora found some kind of transparent goo, lining a crack in the wall while Garrett tried to chisel off a piece of the granite. I thought I saw something shimmering, but it was just the light from my camera reflecting off a piece of quartz. I grabbed it though. I couldn't come up empty-handed. Once our time was up, we came back up for air. We were slow and methodical, but we were getting results. There was no way we'd reach the bottom in 12 hours. But we figured we could get something interesting given enough dives. When we came back up, there were at least 50 people standing in a circle looking at us. Men in hazmat suits brought coolers for us to put the samples in, and 2 technicians were working on an air hose system. We took a short break to wait for them to finish it, change up our air tanks, and plan our second dive. This time we could go deeper. The air hoses could reach 60 feet, but they were already working on an extension. Still, Garrett insisted on refreshing our air tanks as well, just in case. As we hooked up the air hoses, the stiff chemical air from our tanks was exchanged with this musky forest breeze, stinking of dead fish and mud. There was also a little whiff of diesel from one of the on-site generators. As we dove back into the murky waters, we headed straight for the tunnels. This time we were going deeper, past the reeds, past the mud. We mapped out 3 more tunnels, going further and further down. We moved carefully, our new air hoses working as tethers. But it didn't take long for us to reach the limit, and Nora called it in. Surface control. We need a longer line. No response. We waited for a moment, but there was nothing on the other end. Time-wise, it was probably around the break of dawn. Just like Garrett said, we'd gone too deep to hold a solid signal. I can go up and relay, said Garrett. Or we could just tug and hope for the best. I'm not tugging on an air hose, said Nora. Wait, you hearing this? A little burst of static. The camera on my shoulder whirred like crazy. Nora gave me the hand signal for resurfacing and took point. Garrett and I followed. Time to bail. There was a deep rumbling sound coming from beneath. It felt like the ground itself was trying to start a diesel motor. Cycles of rumbling making cracks in the walls. Something big was happening. And we had to get out now. I could feel my breath shortening as my body realized that air was no longer a certainty. The moment Nora got through the first tunnel, I saw the rock wall shift. Solid knife, sharp granite moved with the ease of a child smacking a balloon. To the sound of a deafening thunderstorm, the tunnel collapsed above us. The air hoses got cut, and Nora's foot was crushed into a pulp. Together, they sprayed air and bone fragments into the water. As the sound of our collapsing world got loud enough to rattle my bones, parts of a blood-curdling screech came through our comms. As the water started to move, we were being sucked down. I protected my head as I was tossed around the tunnels. Further and further down, my air tank clinked against the wall. I instinctively gasped for air, but I could feel water rushing into my mask. There was no air supply on the other end. The hose was cut clean. The walls rushed past me. I slammed my shoulder, my knee, my thigh, my shoulder. At one point, I smacked the back of my head, and I could feel my body temperature shift. It was a wound, but not a deep one. Somewhere in the chaos, I felt the camera on my shoulder come loose, and I got into a roll. I spun out of control and lost all sense of distance. It wasn't just a few seconds of suction either. It was a significant amount of time. My world spun and bashed me into the rocks over and over and over. I could feel blood leaving my body, and I was getting cold, colder and colder, but I couldn't tell if it was blood loss or the water. The word disoriented doesn't begin to describe it. At some point, it just stopped. I was floating in this endless pool of darkness, a black bottomless ocean. I couldn't tell what was up and what was down anymore. I tried to move upwards, but it didn't feel right. Not only did my arm refuse to move, but there was too much resistance. It took me a few seconds to realize I was trying to swim downwards. I was upside down. There was water pooling in my mask. I could feel it just under my mouth. I could see little air bubbles popping, and I had to spit to keep my mouth clear. It had a strange, sugary taste mixed with iron, but most of it was blood. Something grabbed me. My first instinct was to fight, but I couldn't. I'd strained my arm, and my left foot was dislocated. I was shivering, and I could see a long gash across my thigh that was just at the limit of what my mask light could pick up. I couldn't even see my feet. Garrett came into focus. He made a hand movement that I didn't recognize. A closed fist with fingers pushing outwards. Push and exhale, right? I exhaled hard, pushing out the water in my mask. The next second, Garrett connected my air tank to my mask. For a moment, we just looked at one another. He had a bad cut just above his right eye, and it was bleeding into his mask. Our comms were dead. We had to rely on hand signals. Garrett put a hand on my cheek and checked my mask for cracks. Seems okay. He gave me the signal for okay, and I responded in kind. I was not okay, but I was well enough to move, if a bit slower. We moved carefully and calmly. There was no way to tell how far down we were, and we had to be careful to preserve our air. At most, we had a little less than an hour of air if we could keep steady. Probably a lot less, though. We held hands, slowly going upwards. It felt right. I was oriented. We kept moving, but it felt like we hadn't moved at all. The water was still black and nothing changed. At one point, Garrett suddenly stopped. I moved up next to him and followed his eyes. He looked upwards, little shimmers in the water. Fish. A school of dozens of little fish. They were about 4 inches long and a strange color of blue. They were completely eyeless, with their entire face covered in a thick octopus-like beak. They avoided us to the best of their ability, shooting past at amazing speed. Still, they were close enough for Garrett to poke them if he wanted to. He didn't, and neither did I. Whatever these were, they were native to the area. They could be venomous. Garrett tightened his grip on my hand, and we kept moving upwards. After 10 minutes of going in a straight line, we came to a full stop. A solid rock ceiling. Just a wall without the hint of an opening or tunnel. It occurred to me that we might have come down horizontally through a side passage. If that was the case, we were doing the human equivalent of a fly buzzing through a window trying to get out. We looked around, but the ceiling was almost completely flat. There was no telling where we ought to go. Still, I had to try and keep calm. Panicking would kill us faster, but even with this seemingly endless large space, I'd never felt so trapped in my entire life. I held my breath, trying to slow the shivers. Garrett reached for his chisel. Poking at the wall, he managed to dislodge a few kernels of granite. He stared at them, looking for any sign of movement. Apart from sinking, they were slightly drifting to our left. Of course, there was a current. I was trying to ignore how much time had passed, and at the same time, counting the seconds, Garrett's diving watch was busted, and mine hadn't been properly reset before the second dive. It was still on time for our first. This was exactly the kind of shit I'd wanted to avoid, but we'd been so stressed to get back in. At one point, the ceiling started to curve, and there finally was an opening. It seemed to lead upwards. We followed it, squeezing through a tight space where I had to exhale to pass through, shimmying forward, breathlessly, inch by inch, tons of unstable rock pressing on my aching chest. And then we broke through the surface just like that. We weren't topside, but this was an air pocket. It was large enough to fit us both as long as we squatted a bit. There was a tunnel leading us further, but we decided to catch our breath. I was the first to shut off my ear and clean out my mask, but Garrett was quick to follow. Finally, we could speak freely. Stale, sugary, sweet air filled our lungs. I coughed, making my ribs ache even more. "The lake water," said Garrett. It hadn't settled with the temperature shifts from the sunrise. That heated it. It got it moving. So, how deep? I asked. At least 300 feet. At least. And that's just straight down, he said. Nora, did you? No, said Garrett, shaking his head. It closed. She might be trapped up there, but at least she won't drown. I nodded, gently massaging my foot. I was going to have to pop it back into place, but just touching my skin sent bolts of pain through me. You can wait, he said. You're hurt. I'm not dying here, I replied. Good, he said. We caught our breaths and checked our equipment. We had about 3/4 of our tanks left, so we were doing pretty good. We had some cuts and bruises, some that might need stitching. Nothing urgent, but it might get bad if left untreated. Who knew what kind of bacteria was down there? I couldn't stop shivering, and Garrett was getting worried. He kept asking if I was sleepy. Honestly, I could feel it. There was something there, eyelids growing heavy. As my lungs strained against my ribs, we got back down underwater, our equipment clean and secured. The tunnels were slowly widening, allowing us to crawl forward. There were a few intersections, and we did our best to map where we'd gone. I had some remaining scraps from the ripped air hose that we pushed into cracks in the wall, sort of marking our path like breadcrumbs at the very least. We could get back to the air pocket if necessary. We went down a few tunnels, only to be met with a series of dead ends. It was a damn labyrinth, and my heart sank with every stop. When we finally found a path going forward, we had a very difficult choice to make. We could circle back and regroup, or push forward and save some time. Every minute moving backwards would be a loss, but every minute forward could be a death sentence. Garrett squeezed my hand, looking for some kind of guidance. I signed forward. The tunnel opened into a vertical shaft going straight up. I could feel a slight rush of water gently pushing us back down. It was only for a moment, but it made me realize that the current was getting stronger. Suddenly, the water started to shimmer. Hundreds of those blue-colored fish rushed past us down into the depths of the tunnels. Maybe they followed the current. Either way, they had to come from somewhere, so we pushed forward. Garrett squeezed my hand in celebration. There was another set of tunnels in the ceiling, branching into several paths. They all looked deep enough to lead somewhere, so we just picked one at random. I couldn't mark our path any further. I had nothing left to leave behind. We kept going upwards until Garrett suddenly stopped. There was something shimmering in a tunnel ahead, some kind of gemstone or quartz. They reflected the lights off our masks. Another dead end. These are predatory and unfeeling. It came out of the dark. It had these long bone-like arms. It didn't swim. It crawled along the rocky walls. It was fast enough to catch those little bluefish. It was large, but that didn't slow it down. It could barely squeeze through the tunnel while Garrett and I could move freely. We were never meant to meet that thing. Never. To this day, I can't look down dark corridors. I imagine those arms reaching out for me. I ignored every safety precaution I've ever known. I rushed, I huffed, I screamed, I crawled, I kicked, and I forced myself back down as fast as humanly possible. I didn't care about the searing pain in my foot. I just kept going all I could feel. Was the water moving behind me as every sudden movement transferred into waves, pushing against my aching limbs? But I didn't care. At that moment, I didn't care about anything but getting away. At the mouth of the tunnel, I turned around for a brief second, only to see Garrett's wide eyes staring back at me. At that moment, I could tell what he was thinking. He realized he was about to die. Long fingers wrapped around him as his right arm was ripped from his socket. I could feel the snap reverberating through the tunnel. Vibrations from his death screams reached me, but all I could hear was my own panicked breathing. I remember flashes of shimmering blue as I fled down tunnel after tunnel. I didn't see a single marker. There was another air pocket, but I just kept pushing forward. I had no idea where I was, but I could feel those dark eyes looking for me, arms reaching for me. The air in my tank started to feel strange, warm, and panicked. I kept going forward. I finally came to another air pocket, and I tore my mask off and shut the air tank. Everything tasted bloody and salty, and it was just this small space, just big enough for my head to fit in if it tilted just right. The light on my mask was dying. It started to flicker. If I held it at the right angle, it was fine, but it was just a matter of time. I stayed there for at least 10 minutes, just trying to breathe. I was lost and freezing. There's no telling how long I'd been down there. I couldn't even tell how much air I had left in the tank, but it wasn't much. If I wanted to move, I had to ration it, but I couldn't move without it. There was no way I'd be lucky enough to find another air pocket within, a minute of free diving, but I couldn't stay here. I didn't trust a single person up there. There were no rescue parties coming down here anytime soon. Even if they wanted to, could they? And even without a predator stalking these tunnels, I was going to freeze to death. And I was still bleeding. Wait, bleeding. Shit, my pulse rose as I felt something shift, a pressure in the tunnel underneath. There was no way I could move fast enough. I just had a hope against hope that it wouldn't find me. Maybe it didn't hunt like a shark. I held my breath and I felt strokes of movement in the water. It was moving this way. I closed my eyes so hard my head started to spin. Tears trickled out of my eyes, making little plopping noises as they hit the surface of the water. It was barely audible, but to me it felt like hammer blows. The strokes stopped. It was close. I carefully opened my eyes to look down, but everything was dark. My mask light had given up. Moments later, the strokes continued past me. Maybe it wasn't used to hunting humans, or maybe it was taking its prey back to the nest. When I could no longer feel the strokes, I exhaled, coughing violently. My mouth tasted blood. There was no choice left. I had to keep going with what little I had. I secured my mask and let my hands rest in the water for a moment. Just floating in that little space was like anything I'd ever experienced before. It was such an alien, primal feeling. I've been in trouble before, but nothing like this. Nothing even remotely like this. I slowed my breathing, and I took the plunge. To my surprise, there was one strange sensation I hadn't noticed. When the lights were off, it was easier to sense the current. Maybe it was a rely on my other senses kind of thing, but it was much clearer, even in the dark. I could feel the right way for me to go, a circulation of some kind coming from above. As I came to a branching tunnel, it was a bit harder to tell where I was supposed to go. I decided to just keep going up, so I did. The current was getting stronger, and all of a sudden I breached into another air pocket. But I could hear something. A metallic clinking. It didn't take me long to find it. Garrett's air tank. On one hand, I was incredibly lucky. On the other hand, that thing was close. Really close. I still had a little juice left in my tank, so I hobbled forward. This air pocket was large, more like a cavern, ankle-deep water forcing me to walk and actually feel my body weight. I've never felt so heavy in all my life, and the equipment didn't help. I was so tired I could easily have lied down and just died or slept. Whatever came first. Instead, I pushed on with an extra tank in hand. I kept going further and further up. I started to hold my breath for as long as I could, using only what little air I had when absolutely necessary. I could feel more of those little fish rushing past me, sometimes with me, sometimes towards me. It dawned on me that they might be fleeing a pursuing predator, and that I was an idiot for not following them. Then again, they might just be following the current. I couldn't tell. I must have flailed around through caves, passages, and tunnels for hours, using every air pocket I could find and eventually just ditching my tank. All I had left was the scraps remaining from Garrett's tank. Every foot started to feel like a death sentence, like I was digging my own grave. Maybe if we just stayed put in first place, someone would have found us. Maybe being proactive was the wrong move. I was going upwards when I felt the air in Garrett's tank start to go bad. When I managed to breach into yet another air pocket, I just threw it aside. This was it. End of the line. The tank clanged against the sides of the cave, and somewhere further and I heard a noise, a little gasp. Something had heard me. I stuck myself to the wall as I heard large, wet feet slapping against the key floor. It had this strange frog-like breath, like air pushing against a membrane. It stopped. It listened. Blood dripped from my arm and plopped against the water. Luckily, it didn't hear me or care. Instead, I heard a bone snap like a carrot, then the sound of gnawing and suckling. I must have stood there paralyzed for at least half an hour, and then I heard it go down a side tunnel and disappear into the deep. This is my shot. I hobbled away, only to step on something. A partly devoured foot. From that point on, it was just systematic and careful plunges. Follow the current for 30 seconds, and if I couldn't feel a way forward, I turned back, caught my breath, and tried a different path. I was still holding my breath so much that my chest had started to ache more than my foot. Still, I was making progress. Finally, I came to this large vertical chute. I felt a rush going upwards. There had to be something. I held my breath for as long as I could, waiting for the surface for an air pocket. But this time there was nothing. Dead end. I just slammed into a smooth surface, knocking myself over the head. A part of me wanted to scream so bad that air pushed out of my lungs. But the surface was smooth, unnaturally so, almost metallic. I pounded it with my fist. It was thin, but heavy, definitely metallic. But with every pounding fist, I could feel something else move. Something was coming from below. It found me. It started with a tickle against my good leg. These little fingers tenderly wrapped themselves around my ankle, ready to pull me down. I didn't let it. I kicked, I crawled, I pushed myself upwards, and I pounded the metal. A cramp in my arm forced me to scream. Something grabbed me from below, pulling me down at least 4 feet before I managed to kick myself loose. Gaining momentum, I flung myself upward, again crashing into the metal surface. But this time it buckled just an inch. But it buckled and suddenly there was light air, and whatever reached for me recoiled in fear. For men had moved what looked like a makeshift manhole cover out of the way, and they pulled me up. I didn't even notice I was breathing. I just forced air into my lungs so I could keep screaming and screaming. Turns out Nora made it to the surface. She'd lost a foot, but she'd made it. She'd been airlifted out and the entry was sealed. They tried to get another diving team, but there was no one else around. If they'd had more time, they'd have flown out another crew of 4 from Minnesota. I was down there for a total of 9 hours and 37 minutes. I had to sign a contract not to speak about this for 10 years. That time is up. And now I'm telling you what I know. Garrett died down there, and Nora was permanently maimed. I like to consider myself lucky, but I didn't come out of this unscathed either. I don't want to go into detail, but there are some wounds that aren't as easily seen as a missing foot. That space was bought by this investment company called Hatchet. I'm pretty sure they're still operating there today. I've seen the chain-link fences and the warning signs, not to mention the armed guards. I've since moved on from diving. I can barely swim in a pool anymore. And honestly, I'm fine with that.